this one is going to be a fire starter indeed, because we're going to be talking about preparing for a future battlefield. And what's so really great about this is that we have the former director of cybersecurity, or excuse me, cyber at GCHQ, and that is Sally Walker, and she is now a founder of Human Digital Thinking, preparing for a future battlefield. Love it.
Suki, thank you so much. cogX audience, good morning. It's an absolute privilege to be here, and sorry not to be with you in person, but the benefit of doing this session virtually is that we can have a conversation between myself and a trusted and brilliant colleague, Ciaran Martin. Ciaran was previously the CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre. He's now Professor of Practice at the Blavatnik School of Oxford University. There's one for a tongue tie. I was going to be extremely complimentary about Ciaran, but I'll keep my introductory comments short, other than to say he really does understand the inner workings of government like few others. And his Twitter account is both informative on cyber and on crisps. So Ciaran, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Sally. Really nice to see you. I promise not to eat any crisps in the course of this.
So we were going to have a conversation over the next 40 minutes. Ciaran and I worked together closely for 4 or 5 years in GCHQ while he was running the National Cyber Security Centre. And we often had the opportunity to debate in private and dispute occasionally, but more often than not, probably agree on the major challenges the UK faces in taking forward the cyber agenda. We're both now outside of government. We've both now got our own reflections on what we achieved while in government and what we see as citizens rather than civil servants. So we're happy to take questions as this session proceeds, subject to the tech holding up. But we thought we'd take this in 3 parts, probably focus on the current and the future threat, the nature of the societal response options, and of course, the future for the UK's cyber strategy. Ciaran, that's my introduction. Anything you want to add to that before we leap into conversation?
Well, just to say, again, thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody at cogX for organising it and to everyone joining us. It's really nice to see you again, Sally. I remember very fondly the years of working together, particularly the early days where I got there to this weird and incomprehensible organisation after 17 years in central Whitehall called GCHQ, which I had the time of my life at, and hopefully we managed to do something good. I always remember 2 things about your contribution in particular. One was sheer operational grip, and the great thing about that is that that's the thing I'm not allowed to talk about, because many of the operations that you were responsible for remain rightly classified, but just that sense of putting all the expertise in public service into direct benefit for citizens. And the second thing was, and I think this is an important point, was a sort of leadership by example. There weren't very many working mothers in senior positions when I got to GCHQ. There were quite a few more by the time we left, and I think that's partly your example. And I do think one of the themes of today, we've got the traditional language of battlefield, but as you know, I feel passionately that we're talking about the battlefield dimensions of something that is now dominating everyday society in largely peaceful and constructive use. And so I think the more perspectives we bring on it and the more openness that we can bring to the debate within reason, the better.
Fabulous. Well, I promise not to talk about the weird and incomprehensible world of operations today, and I won't bore you with my 3 children. But let's get stuck into that societal response. And if I can start, Ciaran, the gap between what we're doing and where this is going, can we start there? I think there was an annual DCMS report published on the cyber sector, February this year, and it stated that cyber sector is now worth 8.9 billion to the UK economy and rising. That's great news, and obviously there's more investment to come, and we'll hear more about that this year. But RUSI also published research that the economic cost of cyber fraud to the UK economy was around 190 billion. So are you surprised by the pace and the nature of the emerging threat, given the priority of cybersecurity investment over the last decade?
No, I'm not. And I think, firstly, the metrics in cybersecurity are really hard. It's one of the paradoxes, and it's a paradox that I can't explain about how in such a tech-rich, data-rich subject, metrics are really hard. And we're seeing that at the minute with ransomware. Now, I'm sure we'll talk about ransomware, but people say, what's the cost of ransomware? And the answer is no one knows, because there are no reporting requirements, so all the secret payments go undisclosed. That's just one example. And I remember way back in 2012, in the 1-year update to the government's 2011 National Cybersecurity Strategy, I bet I'm the only person on the call that remembers that document. There was an attempt by the government to quantify the cost of cyber harms to the UK economy in any 1 year, and I think the figure was 21 billion. And it was a decent effort, but it was ripped apart methodologically, and I don't think the government's ever tried to again, just because the calculations, we find it very hard to price harm in cyberspace. With something like ransomware, you can price it. With something like a data breach, you can't really, or it's very hard to. Having said all that, I think there are 2 points I'd make. One is positive and one is slightly negative, with a bit of positive tail. So the positive remark I'd make is that I just don't think there's any credible evidence that the harms being done outstrip the benefits. Now, there are serious online harms, as we've grown accustomed to calling them, but at the end of the day, if there was a clear emerging consensus that this whole thing was more trouble than it's worth because of all the security and other harms it was doing, then presumably policymakers and campaign groups and ordinary citizens would be thinking, wouldn't be allowing the pace of technological change to let rip. But it's bringing so many wider benefits, particularly as we've seen over the last year with the pandemic. It's kept us going, that it is offsetting the harms. So that's the positive point. The slightly negative point, with the positive sting in the tail, is that the reason it doesn't surprise me is that the first 25, 30 years of mass market technology have been based on inherently insecure technology. So we've got, we've got a new technology or set of technologies that are exploding into everyday use, taking over commerce, everyday communication, social activity, and none of them were built with security in mind, as their founding fathers and the occasional founding mother now admit. So if you take the likes of Vint Cerf at Google, has said in a great quote, when we were building all this stuff, we didn't focus enough on the people who try and break it. And I think that's right. So we now have a whole bunch of technologies that aren't really up in terms of economically, they can bear the weight that's been put on them, but in security terms, they can't. The good news is that as technology changes, we can spot that, and that we can begin to adapt it. So, things like IoT, I think we can, on Internet of Things, because it's something you can hold and something, it involves hardware, you can have objective security and safety standards in that. So if we get that right, then I think we can fix that big challenge. Till then, I think we're stuck with some aspect of modeling through on the technology we have. But I'd be interested in your views, as to whether you accept that analysis. And then I think there is a point as well about the response. There has been, and we've debated this ad nauseum before, a perceived tension sometimes between securing it and exploiting the insecurities of others. But also there's then just the efficacy argument, to what extent are you whacking walls if you're just striking back at people? And is there a trade-off between trying to secure your own technology and the even resource and policy focus on, I feel like, striking back? So that's something I think, my views are evolving on it, and I think there's plenty of debate about it. But I mean, you know more about it than I do, so I'd be interested in your reflections on that point.
So on your, do I accept your analysis of the cost versus the benefit? I think I do, up to a point. I think the bit that's missing for me is the human cost, and particularly in the areas that we don't talk a lot about as society around child sex exploitation, the grey economy. It's a murky world. It's difficult to measure. It doesn't translate into Hollywood. We might come back to that with the battlefield analogies. But it is really difficult to put a cost on that. And yet the human cost is profound. And I think if we are going to talk in a cyber strategy more holistically about safety in a digital environment, we have to start bringing that cost into the equation and making it perhaps less technocratic. But otherwise, I completely accept your analysis. I think, that the benefit of a free and open internet underpins our commercial freedom, it also underpins our democratic freedom. And that's why it's so important that we can defend it effectively and holistically. So I completely accept your analysis, as I say, with that one qualifying point. Just remind me of your second question around capability and response. How do you want me to frame
Well, I was
that?
just interested then, to what extent do you think we should be fighting our way back out of this, as opposed to the more, if you like, mundane focus on securing technology? I mean, there are, I think, two debates. One is there a trade-off between securing our own technological base and being able to exploit weaknesses in others in order to disrupt the child sexual exploiters and other horrific practices, particularly nation states, because they're better at it than organized crime by and large. So that's the first one. Is there that sort of equities trade-off that people have talked about now for some years? But the second point is actually, is it effective both tactically and strategically? We have been, I think one of the peculiarities of the current debate, particularly in the United States, is for those who advocate a more aggressive approach in terms of offensive cyber, it's almost as if it hasn't been tried, and it hasn't been talked about that much, but that's not the same thing as it's not being tried. And I think there's enough in the public domain that we can talk about it. There is, and in fact, I'm quite sympathetic to this, there's a debate about to what extent we should be using offensive capabilities on the likes of the ransomware operators. So I'm just interested. So there's a sort of principled argument about equities, but there's also a sort of practical efficacy argument. I mean, frankly, does this stuff work, or does it make for the odd good operational headline, but actually it's not a strategic sort of hit against the bad people?
So there's a huge amount in there, isn't there? On the trade-off of equities, I think it should be an absolute foundational principle of the West that if we know there's a vulnerability, that should be our priority. We should be endeavoring to make society safe. And that goes well beyond making technology secure. I think there's a huge amount in there that's beyond government. And I think the private sector's got a role to play in stepping up. It isn't sufficient to say if you've got the latest iteration of technology or the latest patches, then you're okay. But if you're living off a platform that you bought third hand off your mate or your granny's been donated it, then they're not secure or safe. So there's just so much richness to the debate about how you tackle a ever expanding universe of vulnerability. I think it's very interesting as to why we accept continued expansion of that vulnerability in the pursuit of growth and progress, and yet we're not tackling the baseline foundations of security. So I think the equities debate is interesting, but I don't think it's symmetrical, and I think that's tainting the debate. You and I have had this conversation before. The kind of offense defense lends itself to imagining we're playing some grand game of football, and I just refute that analogy completely. I think they're different concepts for different purposes. The requirement to secure the homeland is foundational. The requirement to use capabilities upstream to tackle threats is necessary, and the capabilities you use to tackle those threats includes the cyber arsenal, and arsenal isn't necessarily a helpful set of language, but of course you have to go and tackle those threats wherever you can, and we've done it against drugs and terrorists and other imported or imposed harms. The fact they're operating in the virtual world or perhaps in the shadows or be able to be unattributed brings a whole different range of challenges, but our strategic approach needs to be as comprehensive as it can be. I think that is offensive cyber effective comes to risk calculus. I always used to say, and I still believe it now, that it's been used effectively against us. It's been used effectively against the West. And I don't accept, therefore, however, the position taken by some that offensive cyber therefore needs to be used outside of a legal and ethical framework in order to be useful. I will always be proud of what we did and the fact that that legal and ethical framework was absolute for everything that we did, in every operation, in every development and capability, in every conversation that was had around what we were doing and how we were doing it, and how doctrine and practice and strategy would need to emerge in the future. But I think and maybe this is a point to bring it back to ransomware, the risk calculus is there in the minds of our adversaries. if they don't perceive there to be a risk or a threat, they will continue to operate unconstrained. The ransomware operators are incredibly sophisticated about what their risk calculus is, and they're thinking about where to leverage their ransom based on what they perceive the risk to be. And if you're a hairdresser, you might get hit for £1,000, and if you're a oil pipeline operator, you might get a fair number of noughts added on. But they are considering retaliation and response and state options and law enforcement options in calibrating their approach. And that risk calculus, to me, is the part of the cyber deterrence debate and the cyber operational debate that we keep going past and going straight to activity and response in some kind of tactical trade-off, rather than a much more holistic approach to mindset and motivation and ultimate outcomes.
So I think that's interesting.
Yes, and then we'll come back. But I think it's been used against us.
But I think on the ransomware thing, that's quite interesting, because I think it shows to some extent why I would concur with a lot of what you said, but to a different extent, I think it also shows how the equities and so forth debate does matter a little bit, in terms of not so much whether we're weakening security, but just whether we're making enough of a focus on it. So I think that the ransomware is about a risk framework for the criminals, but actually more of an opportunity framework for them. It's a business. Ransomware is a business. It's a rate of return calculation for them. And at the moment, the input costs and risks of doing business are very low, and the rewards are very high. So the British firm, very good British cybersecurity firm called Elliptic, has just done an estimate of what DarkSide, the Colonial Pipeline hackers, made, and they've traced verifiably, as I understand it, $90 million in 9 months. Now, I don't know, A, to what extent that's $90 million minimum, and that's more, and B, I don't know what the input costs are to make the $90 million return, but I bet you they're very, very low, because doing ransomware is not expensive. The risks, well, for as long as the Russian Federation provides the safe haven for them to operate in, the risks are very low as long as they don't travel outside Russia. There was one apparent malware developer for a ransomware gang who traveled on holiday to Miami and isn't coming back. And some have suggested that this person might win a Darwin Award in the cyber subdivision for doing something incredibly stupid. More seriously, though, I think there is a school of thought in some parts of the US cybersecurity industry that, and this plays to your point about risk, which is that ransomware has gone from nothing to a G7 communique headline in a few months. So clearly the hackers of Colonial Pipeline and so on overreached and are now incurring the fury and wrath of other ransomware hackers, because now, frankly, a US and Western political system that was prepared, given everything else they've got to cope with, to tolerate the theft of wealth from rich companies, is now no longer prepared to do it. Having said all that, I still think it's hard to incentivize the Russian regime to do something about the problem. So then you get into, you had the recovery by the US authorities and a brilliant operation of some of the ransom that Colonial Pipeline paid through raiding a Bitcoin wallet, however they did it, getting the private key. But that does seem to be the sort of operation that won't scale. So I think it does come back to the fact that there is a strategic and structural problem, which is an attack on the ordinary IT system by a criminal gang, not by a state, but of an ordinary IT system. The emails, the billing, the HR, not the industrial controls of the pipeline, was enough to bring about fuel shortages in the United States. A similar attack on Irish healthcare was enough to get cancelled operations, cancelled maternity appointments, and even now ongoing difficulties with getting appointments. So I don't see a way past the structural, addressing some of the structural defects of our own technology as the core of this strategy. But I interrupted.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've talked here about a relatively unsophisticated threat that has bypassed all of the normal response options. It's almost bypassed the technical community and gone straight to the G7 as a response. And as you say, that's got consequences for the actors. But why is it, you think, would you agree that this debate is just missing sectors that are absolutely critical to future success? Where is the private sector in addressing these foundational infrastructure vulnerabilities? Where is the the academic sector in getting different impressions of cyber threat and digital understanding into the classroom. Why is it that after all of these years of investment, all of this attention by government, bits of defence, bits of law enforcement, really impressive progress through in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre and others in reaching out in partnership, we still haven't got an ecosystem that can interject and start managing these problems before they hit the national, international media headlines?
So my view on that, be interested in your response, my view on that, which is I think quite hard to prove and you could do with more elucidation, is that the analysis and a lot of the operational response belongs rightly in the national security community. And actually, with all the 10, 15 years of doing this, both in the UK and through partners, we're getting quite good at that. And actually, when you want to bring in international partners, security cooperation, by comparison with what I'm about to talk about, is quite easy. And, the UK and the US, the Five Eyes, even despite all the tensions of the last few years, continental Europe, we are quite good at saying at national security level, here's a bunch of capability, here's a bunch of threat coming from Russia, China, organized criminality, here's a bunch of capabilities, here's a bunch of information, let's kind of make the best of it. And we're not bad at that, we're getting better, we're not perfect by any means. But so many of the solutions to the structural problems are economic. And what we are bad at in the West, in a way that, say, an authoritarian state like China is not, doesn't suffer the same thing, is taking all of these national security issues, and ransomware is the classic here, and bringing them into the economic incentives. I mean, when I was at the National Cybersecurity Centre, one of our biggest problems that we used to debate forever was that security doesn't pay. Nobody's incentivized to do it properly. The solutions to that are not in militarized concepts, they're in economic policy, they're in microeconomic policy, they're in things like getting insurance working properly, they're in things like getting corporate risk, they're actually in things like, what is your hair salon example is brilliant, and it's based on, as we both know, real cases, including in the Gloucestershire area, as well as the big companies that run pipelines. How do you incentivize a set of arrangements whereby a small company doing people's hair makes appropriate cybersecurity provision they can afford and know how to use, and at the same time people running pipelines do the same, because at the minute neither are really working. I think in the UK there are some signs of good progress, but that's what we've got to crack. And that's as much of the strategic challenge, I think, as in a sense, if we are talking about a future battlefield, and I know you might want to respond to this, that language makes me slightly uneasy. This is as much of the battlefield. The only problem is it's a battlefield of very normal activity, getting petrol to pumps in the east coast of the United States and getting people's hair done. I'm serious about that.
So I'll respond on the battlefield point, and I'm conscious we probably need to keep moving on to strategy, otherwise we're going to run out of time, as we predicted. I increasingly feel strongly the language of the battlefield and the militarization of the language isn't working. There's a different debate as to the role of defense, which I view as absolutely critical, the combat support function of cyber capabilities, which is absolutely critical, were we to go into conflict. But the public narrative isn't landing. And that's what's really surprised me coming out of the bubble of the civil service in a world where we talked this stuff through, debated it, argued it, got overly technical about what wasn't a cyber attack. But the concept of our technology and our systems being used against us to do things that are unexpected or cause harm isn't a narrative that is out there in the public ecosystem. And I think that's why I think it's important that we have these conversations, have these debates, particularly around the authorities' frameworks, ethical code, the link to our democratic values, and so on. And so, if any colleagues from the defence community are watching this, then I would really encourage people to translate and ensure that their message is designed for their audience, not for their peer group. Because we have to get a different public message across in the cyber arena, and it isn't one of conflict and throwing cyber bombs at each other.
And for you, how does that translate into a future strategy? Everybody talks about holistic, integrated, whatever the particular buzzword is. I mean, what does that mean for you in terms of defense and other capabilities?
So it's almost park the operations rooms of the future. As you say, that's the governmental response, that's the national security community, that's law enforcement, who are absolutely part of that. The ops room of the future, government will take care of. But the classroom and the boardroom, a different conversation is needed. And government can't facilitate that conversation, no matter how good its outreach and its engagement. There just isn't the capacity to run the country and connect with society. So they have to help others. I think the academic curriculum needs serious consideration, not just cyber as a sort of add-on to STEM and are you technically minded, but have you got a digital safety mindset? Are you thinking differently about your operating environment? Zoom, the digital world isn't a classroom on Zoom. The digital world is the environment our kids grow up in. They have to make decisions within that world. They have to use capability. They have to know what to trust, what to believe in, how to identify scammers and crooks and, the dark side of the internet, so that they can experience that cost benefit analysis you said at the front, at the start of this conversation. The benefit is absolutely there for the next generation. But we're going to have to teach them how to think differently if they're going to make the most of it. And then boardrooms need to get ahead of the threat. And you've put a lot of work into this, a lot more than I have. But I think, CEOs cannot delegate this to their IT departments and their chief information security officers and others and say, that's for you to manage the tech threat. They have to understand ransomware is showing the reputational risk, the operational risk that they are taking if they don't understand their platforms, if they don't understand the location of their data, if they don't understand their business continuity requirements, if they're not taking proactive steps now to get ahead of the threat. But I'm sure that a national cyber security strategy, a national cyber strategy needs to think about that boardroom and classroom as much as it does what government does for itself by itself. That's what I'm anticipating will need to be focused on. Would you agree with that? And what have I missed?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think, and you might be surprised that it's me saying this, I do understand why the defense community has alighted on cyber as a challenge, not just for, and a challenge for defense itself. And it is a challenge for defense itself, and defense needs to make sure that it's got its own capabilities in order. I mean, there's GCHQ's oldest security function that predates the National Cybersecurity Centre by many decades is securing military and intelligence cryptographic assets, and we can be very proud of some of the brilliant work that's done there. And we need to make sure that that sort of ability is maintained. There is, I think, a good job to be done in actually looking calmly at future military and quasi and hybrid conflict in cyberspace and what that actually means, as distinct from some of the more sensational aspects of it. I mean, I remember one presentation I saw which implied that anonymized killer robots were imminent, and that it couldn't be detected, but and to a point I know you're passionate about, when we question the assumptions for this, no human agency at any point was involved in trying to interdict these things. So it was your classic, the technology is available, therefore it will happen, which is of course not true. I also think there's an important role for defense and wider government in supporting the state. I think that one of the things that the ransomware crisis will bring open is that there are different economies are structured differently. So in the UK and Ireland, when healthcare gets hit, as it has in 2021 in Ireland, 2017 in the UK, the government just does it. It leads, it's prime ministerial level business. In the United States, absent other considerations, it's the hospital chief executives. And I think, if you look at I think the very powerful imagery of Ireland's small defence forces doing the best they can to restore operations in the health service, I think that's the sort of, if you want an image of the whole of society effort, then there you go. And I think that's sort of where we're going in the future. I do think, though, that it's your point about environment. I think we need to be thinking a lot more about the digital environment in which we're living. I mean, one thing that genuinely begins to terrify me is the proliferation of cyber tools and the carelessness with which they're and malevolence sometimes with which they're just dumped onto the open market. And again, that takes you into economics and regulation and so forth, but it also takes you back into the realm of trust. I think we do have to make sure that and one of the reasons why I think some of the stuff in the integrated review is really, really strong in the UK, particularly the stuff on actually that securing our technological base is now far more complicated than just securing the networks. It's about the materials, the supply chains and all of that. And as China develops a more authoritarian model, that becomes even more challenging. And we've had some pretty difficult cases in the UK to go along with that. But I think some of the things that one thing that I think the integrated review, I hope, got a little bit wrong, which I think the National Cyber Strategy should correct, is that if you were new to the UK and were interested in its digital posture and only read the integrated review, you would think the UK government was terrified of the internet. It was this malevolent force that had to be dominated and contested without any of the stuff about its opportunities and so forth. And I do think if we're going to, apart from anything else, that's the wrong posture economically, but if we're going to win trust, to say, look, I think, put it this way, the UK government, when it puts out all its strategies and all its activities on the digital domain, if the answer to the question, are you in favour and actively pursuing a safer digital environment, if that isn't an unambiguous, unqualified yes, then I think it's the wrong answer.
There's a lot in there, Ciaran, about language, and questions are coming up in the chat around language, particularly about the difference between safety and security. I read something the other day which said that security is something you know and safety is something you feel. And I thought that was really interesting. It was a paper from the health and safety industry. It plays across into the airline sector, where they've got their extraordinary transparent near-miss reporting, without fear of discipline or anything else. Do you think the language is the problem or a part of the issue, or do you wish that we could focus differently on any aspect? As we take the strategy forward, given the focus on the G7, the NATO communique that came out yesterday, there's new language emerging, but do you think this is a game changer, or is it just a maturity where we're evolving the concepts?
So I think I won't go back to the G7 stuff, if that's right, because I think actually the security and safety distinction is really interesting. And I think it was Professor Ross Anderson at Cambridge that I first heard point out that the English language is unusual. You're a much better linguist than I am, Sal, but that English is unusual amongst European languages in having two different words for the same, for security and safety. In French it's sécurité, and Spanish seguridad, and it covers both. And actually the English language is quite helpful in distinguishing between the two because they're not the same thing. And if you take the age-old question of critical infrastructure protection in cyberspace, actually, by and large, the safety aspect is quite good because critical industries are designed to do safety well. And you can argue, and we won't know the full details until it's properly evaluated, but with Colonial Pipelines, shutting down the pipeline, well, it shows you that when you have an alert, you take precautionary action. I remember, looking at, for example, if there was a hostile attack on the railway signaling station, what happens? And the answer is it one, the trains keep going, causing multiple fatalities, or two, they stop, causing mass inconvenience? And obviously it's two. So safety, actually, not least because of the aviation industry and so on, is really quite good. And the connections between cyber and non-cyber are reasonably, cyber and non-cyber factors are reasonably understood. But to an extent, because for decades, critical industry regulation has been dominated by safety for completely understandable reasons, and we're never going to get away from that. Actually, security in many respects in cyber has been quite poor. And so the sort of, chronic damage of data loss, of lacking confidence, and now bleeding through into actual service disruption through ransomware, I think shows you that, we need both, and we do need to think about security and safety a little bit separately before bringing them together. And if it is just about safety and outcomes, then in the digital age, then that misses a whole pile of disruptive activity. If you take airlines, for example, of course, their first priority is going to be keeping planes safe in the sky. But at the same time, if that is the focus of what we call security, then you miss the large-scale theft of passenger lists for espionage or data exploitation reasons, which, of course, as we know from regulatory enforcement, has been happening all the time. So I'll probably put it back to you on the sort of wider strategic point about the G7 and the geopolitics. But I think just in terms of as a defender, which I have been for the last 6.5 years, it's a crucial distinction and a great question.
Yeah, and we've only got 4 minutes left, so we can't really go into this too much. I think I would have gone next to trust, which is the other side of that. And I agree with you completely. Of course, it is safety and security, and we cannot allow the pendulum to swing so that we lose the progress that the cybersecurity community have made in pursuit of a different agenda that seemed to be a different set of priorities. I think that's what's interesting about the ransomware approach is it is building on top of an established set of improvements that an industry and a whole cyber sector has made. But there's more to do. And if we had longer, we'd be talking about trust, the human in the loop, the data integrity risk and where that might go strategically. I'm seeing questions come in. How do we mitigate activist employees? This is insider threat. There's another one about a better adapted legal framework and whether that would give us something to operate within. But I'm afraid we're going to be out of time pretty quickly. So, Ciaran, I'm going to come to you for closing comments on what's been as ever a broad-ranging and to me fascinating conversation. I hope the audience has enjoyed it too. I think what I hope you and I have managed to convey to our audience is that across government, there are different perspectives, but a real common purpose around this sector, around its strategic importance, around the threat and the impact it can have on society. And we recognise that is a conversation that needs to continue way beyond the national security community, important as they are. But Ciaran, closing comments from you?
Well, first, just very quickly on the two interesting outstanding questions, the question about activist employees hijacking companies tasked with contractual military technology innovations. Hard problem. I think, to be fair to the government, starting to recognise it, and the whole suite of new national security investment controls is an important recognition, and we'll see over time whether that framework proves effectively. On Nicholas Beale's excellent question about the successful offensive operations, if you like, on the Bitcoin wallet of the ransomware group and Anom, whether the legal framework could be adapted. I think, to be honest, the legal framework is reasonably permissive. I think the challenge there is not so much the legal framework, but scaling these operations. They take a lot of planning and a lot of resources. So my final point goes back to, I think, the strategic challenge of, but I think this, to finish on an optimistic note, technology is changing and we can see the way broadly it's changing. So let's actually look at those factors. Let's look at how do we make it usable safely by humans in a way that the early internet was not. How do we take as much of the pain away from people through looking at those sort of market failures. And I think, I think the time, the circumstances have never been more propitious with those changes in technology, with the focus on things like ransomware, with the I think realization that this can't just be left to national security and defense communities because they don't have the levers. They don't, this is fundamentally primarily a domain of peaceful human activity. And so let's get the factors that incentivize humans to act properly within a proper framework, well-governed but free framework. Let's get those factors working properly in cyberspace, and I think we can do that. And that would be my final comment. Back to you, Sal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ciaran. I think we agree completely in that, the interface between human and technology, technology and human, and the fact that it's all of us. So this has been a conversation between two of us. Hopefully over the course of the next year, it'll be a conversation between a lot more of us, developing on the good work that's been done across this sector. Thank you for your time and your attention.